3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. Hola, hola, hola. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to TPRS Spanish Stories Podcast. Welcome to Slow Spanish Language Podcast. Guys, this is not a podcast. Welcome to Spanish with Dennis. Yes, YouTube, my intro of the first video on my new channel. Maybe you already know about me, maybe you don't know who am I, and maybe you are wondering why I am talking to the microphone and not looking into the camera like a podcast without video. It's because, guys, I have podcasts. I have four podcasts, and I am a podcaster. For more than 2 years, I am creating episodes weeks after weeks on my 4 podcasts. Yes. And today we will talk a little bit more later about that, about my podcast. But who am I? I am a native speaker of Spanish, and here in this channel we will learn about the culture, about the language, or related with Spanish. And I love to do this because for 2 years I created a lot of interesting content for people that are learning Spanish all over the world. I have a lot of listeners on all my podcasts, for example, from England, Australia, USA, Japan, Italy, Canada, also France, also Spain, I say Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, Russia, and a lot of more of countries, guys. I have a lot of listeners who are learning Spanish with me from my podcast, and now I decided to create YouTube channel because I think it will be very useful to create something interesting for all of you. Let's talk a little bit about my work. My podcast, 4 podcasts: TPRS Spanish Stories, Slow Spanish Language Podcast, Comprehensible Spanish Podcast, and Crazy Stories in Spanish, guys. Yes, I have 4 podcasts, and I will talk about that now. I need to get used to the microphone, but also to the camera, because now it's video, not only podcast, guys. All this time I was dancing, singing, screaming to the microphone, but now I have the video on YouTube for all of you. So, guys, let's check her out. Let's see about what I'm talking about, the podcaster that I am. Let's see. So here we are, guys. Here we are. And what I'm talking about this, guys. Check her out. I have 4 podcasts: Slow Spanish Language, Crazy Stories in Spanish, TPRS Spanish Stories, and Comprehensible Spanish Language, guys. 4. Let's see about what I've been doing the last 2 years. Slow Spanish Language Podcast. This is a podcast for people that are learning Spanish and want to learn more about the culture. What I do here, for example, I translate and read songs, poems, different things in Spanish. And the interesting thing here is all popular. For example, Historia de un Amor, very popular song in Spanish. Tuyo, from the Narco series opening 10. Also, Me Gustas Tú, Manu Chao, very popular song. And Por una Cabeza, Carlos Gardel, La Cucaracha, very popular song in Spanish. So, what we do here, let's open one episode. This is my episode of La Cucaracha, the song. Yeah. So I translate the song. I read the song in Spanish, very slow, very understandable. Then I translate to English sentence by sentence, word by word. And then at the end, I read again in normal speed, and you all understand everything. And I think it's a very good, interesting way to learn Spanish. I have a lot of listeners in this podcast, guys, and it's very, very one of the most listened podcasts on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can check it out. I think it will be useful for you too if you never listened before. And there are different songs, poems, and different topics, guys. This is my Slow Spanish Language Podcast. In Crazy Stories, like the name itself, Crazy Stories in Spanish, I only speak in Spanish here, guys. The Spanish that you need to listen to improve your listening. The Crazy Stories, I bring in every episode different stories, so you can listen only in Spanish and you can listen, understand how native speakers speak Spanish. And all the stories are crazy, so I think it's interesting to listen something in Spanish to improve listening. Like, for example, the alien adoption, or the men that travel in time, the Nazis created zombies, and one of my favorites here. And here we have one of the most listened episodes on Apple Podcasts, the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Federer. Yes, I advise you to listen to this one. Maybe you will like all the episodes. Yeah, guys, check her out. It's very useful to learn Spanish listening something. I think in any language, yes? The next podcast is TPRS Spanish Stories. This podcast is more for beginners. If you are also having intermediate level or advanced, it will be cool for you to listen something interesting, learn new words, new vocabulary. It's very useful podcast. And what I do here in this podcast, guy, I use the method TPRS, and it's a very, very useful method to learn Spanish. Teaching proficiency to reading and storytelling. Storytelling is very important. And interesting stories because they are not usual stories. Michael Jordan, police officer. Leonardo DiCaprio, basketball player. Eminem dances Russian ballet. Harry Potter, the president of England and USA. Sherlock Holmes is a pianist. The interesting thing here, guys, is that you will be listening at your story, and we need to use the method. The method consists, for example, let's try to open this one. Leonardo DiCaprio is a basketball player. So there is a short story here. I read the story in Spanish, then I translate it into English, and then I ask you question. For example, Leonardo DiCaprio es un jugador de baloncesto, and I give you some seconds silence so you can answer to the question out loud. And it's very useful. It looks simple, but it's very useful. And then after I answer the question here. Very useful podcast with the TPRS method, with simple stories, short stories, but stories that you will remember all life, because all these stories are not, I don't know, usual, yeah? And the last one is Comprehensible Spanish language. In this podcast, I only speak in Spanish, guys, and it's for listening to. In this podcast, I bring, I don't know, different topics like apps to learn Spanish, like can you learn a language with Duolingo, series in Spanish or TV shows that you can watch to improve your listening, also songs, also tips. Yeah, different topics, guys, for improved listening. This is what I've been doing in the last 2 years, podcast for people who are learning the language. And interesting, guys, very interesting, is that here you can listen to my podcast in different platforms or apps. For example, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Castbox, Amazon Music, and all this and even more, guys. You can listen to my podcast. This one, for example, TPRS Spanish Stories, with the method teaching proficiency through story reading and storytelling, is very useful. And look, all these stories, Fidel Castro want to go to space. Brad Pitt is a taxi driver. Pablo Escobar is a soccer player. Can you imagine some of these stories in your life, like real? Yeah, guys, they look like silly, they look like simple, but it's very useful method to learn Spanish, and I create stories for you so you can remember all your life if you are learning the language. And I have another one here, slow Spanish language, for example. Look here, all the same. In this podcast, I already explained what I do here, and you can listen to different episodes and read the text on the description, and you can listen and read at the same time. And it's very useful. It's very useful, guys. So this is me, guys. This is me. I create podcasts. I create different episodes for you to learn Spanish. And now I decided to create a YouTube channel. Why? Look here, the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Federer. Very interesting episode. You need to listen to this episode. All the episodes are interesting. If you want to improve Spanish listening in crazy stories, go there. You will find on every platform or app. Guys, now let's talk about YouTube channel, my new YouTube channel. Because now it's videos, not only podcasts. I'm here. I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm a podcaster, but I need to get used to be a YouTuber now, because I will create videos, interesting content for all of you. If you are listening now, Remember that in some days you will be, I don't know, weeks, I don't know when, but I want to create interesting content for all of you. And I already had some ideas. So guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, Spanish with Dennis. Let's learn Spanish together. I want to help you. I love what I do with podcasts, and now I want to do something new. I want to create something new for all of you. So I don't need to say something else. I just want to say welcome to Spanish with Dennis. Bienvenidos a Español con Dennis. Y nos vemos en la próxima. Nos vemos en el próximo vídeo. Nos vemos en el próximo. See you later. Hasta la vista. Hasta la vista. Adiós. Chao. Nos vemos.